And before we got started, we had a very interesting talk about the Tokyo Olympics. Always do this. We always try and keep things for the podcast, end up talking for 5 minutes beforehand anyway. But you were one of the lucky few, I should say, who went out to Tokyo and witnessed a very different Olympic Games, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic scuppering a lot of plans, moving a lot of things. At one point it was on, off, no fans, Japanese fans only. What was the experience like out there for you?
It was different and it was difficult at times, but it was fascinating also to witness how the Games was happening in such difficult circumstances, because that was the 8th Olympic Games that I've been at. And one of the joys of the Games, I've always said in the past, and for the last 5 Games, I've concentrated solely on athletics. So I've been in the main showpiece stadium for 10 days of the Games. And that was the same this time around, but what was missing was that chance to get a feel for the city where the Games are, whether it's Rio or Barcelona, my first Games, and just to mingle with the local people on tubes, buses, trams and trains, whatever the case may be, on the way into the stadium, on the way out of the stadium, getting food afterwards. But that wasn't possible this time because of the restrictions. We were on and off media buses into the stadium, out of the stadium 4 times a day, and straight back to the hotel to our residences. We had 3 days of what they called hard quarantine first of all, and then 14 days of softer quarantine. The 3 days hard quarantine was literally in the room for 3 days. We were allowed to leave for 15 minutes to leave the hotel to go to a local store, a kind of a 7-Eleven store or whatever it was called. But there was a security guard on the door of the hotel timing you out and timing you in, and it was 15 minutes out and in, back to the room. And then after that, the next 14 days were restricted in the sense that you had to let the local organising committee know where you were going. So in Games gone by, if I had a chance to go to watch boxing in between the athletic sessions, then I would wander over to that venue if it was doable in the time span. But that wasn't possible this time unless I'd given the authorities notice that I'd be getting on this bus at that time going to this venue. And that was understandable because they were so worried about rising cases of COVID. And they were just beginning to feel it in the kind of crisis sense that we've had for a year and more. And so they were trying to limit the damage that we as outsiders would bring into their country. And I'm telling you all this as a commentator, but what I saw in the stadium, and I know I've picked up since in terms of the standard in the boxing arena as well, is that it's just remarkable that these athletes, with all the uncertainty that they've had for a year and more, wondering whether the Games are going to go ahead. The day I flew was the day before the opening ceremony, and on that day, one of the leading members of the organising committee said the Games might still be cancelled. So you imagine that as a competitor, all the work that you've done in the build-up, and you're just beginning to... Boxers would know this, but all athletes and all competitors across the sports would know that they almost have a countdown. They would have known turning into 2021 when their heats are, when their semi-finals are, when their final is, down to the day of the calendar, the hour of the day. They would have been saying on New Year's Day, New Year's Eve going into New Year's Day, they would have been saying on August the 2nd, I'll be getting up at 6 a.m. That's how these top-class athletes work. So to be told or to be almost cautioned the day before that, hang about, these Games might not happen. And that kind of uncertainty was filtering all the way through. There were many newspapers over here that were talking about the Games not going ahead for months and months in the build-up. So with that in mind, how do you go to the gym, to the training track, time and time again, and absolutely put everything in? But these people did, and what I saw in the stadium was sport just about as good as I've ever seen at an Olympic Games, with world records and performances generally that were of such a high standard that it's astonishing that these athletes psychologically got themselves ready in the way that they did. And I know you followed the boxing a lot from back here in the UK, and you'll agree that the standards in boxing were as high as I've known also at the Olympic Games, in particular in the women's boxing. But again, given all the uncertainty that's been around all of the sports and all of those competitors, it was amazing that they produced what they did in those circumstances.
I agree. Just to echo everything you've said there, people also have to understand that these athletes have been training for these games for years and years, not even just the 4-year cycle. Since they were
That's
young
the
children.
misconception. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, they've been training for 4 years for this." They've been training forever for this. Most of these athletes, it doesn't come around, by chance. It's years and years of hard graft, and years of mental torture sometimes as well. Getting over injuries, getting over not being selected in boxing terms, or whatever the case may be, and to still have all of that uncertainty all the way through to the start line is really difficult, and that's what they had to overcome, and they did.
It's an incredible mental resolve that athletes of that level have to have anyway. But even to kind of up the stakes even more and have that additional uncertainty really does make you appreciate just how dedicated and just how good these athletes are in their respective fields. You mentioned the boxing there. I understand that you didn't catch an awful lot of it, but from what you saw, what did you make of the boxing? Obviously, we've spoken about the level being very, very high, very successful games for Team GB's boxers. I think we've got the highest number of medals, we've got 6 medals at the games. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think if we look at the games in terms of what they mean for the game that we're in and the jobs that we're in, then boxing is flourishing in this country. And I remember Robert Smith from the Board of Control saying to me 5 or 6 years ago that one of the reasons that the sport is flourishing in the way it is in this country is because of the Olympic setup, the GB team in Sheffield, and how this ongoing cycle of talent is being pushed through time and again, Olympics after Olympics, World Championships after World Championships. So I think coming out of the Games, I think we can all be really buoyant about the next 3 and 4 years, the next Olympic cycle until the next group come through. But I got to see a couple of sessions early on. And going back to what we were saying, Rob, about what these athletes have to put in, Lauren Price boxed in her first contest on one of the days that I was there. And I interviewed her afterwards in the mix zone. And she was boxing at about 11:30 in the morning. And so I asked her what time she weighed in, and she weighed in at 6:30. So again, this is an element, particularly of the boxing, that most other sports don't have to deal with. Every time they compete, they have to weigh in. So her weigh-in's at 6:30 in the morning. So I think most people would understand that if you're getting up for work at 6:30 or you're getting up for a flight at 6:30 or whatever, most times you don't sleep because you're all the time fearing you don't hear the alarm, whatever the case may be. But she was almost nonchalant about it. Yeah, I knew it. So I knew, and she would have known weeks in advance that her contest was, after the draw had been made, that her contest would be not necessarily at 11:30, but she would have seen that on the draw weeks in advance, the middleweight preliminaries were at this time. And so she would have got her head round a weigh-in that would have been at 6:30. And that was, to me, again, just underlining how special these athletes, boxers, competitors are. But then I got to see the last day of finals when they had only 4 contests. And again, Lauren Price was there and won her final easily. In effect, her final was in the semi-final against Fontaine, the Dutch athlete, who she and Savannah Marshall have had issues with in the past. But also on that day was the contest between Keyshawn Davis, who I've been following on when I was on the BBC podcast for 3 years now, as for me, one of the great talents coming through, and I've been waiting for him to turn pro. But he was beaten for the 3rd time by the Cuban Andy Cruz on that last day of finals. And I know we agree that it's unlikely that we will see a contest, amateur or pro, anywhere in the world this year with that much talent in the same ring at the same time. It's just fantastic. And it would be wonderful to see them both turning over. I know Keyshawn Davis has already turned over and had gone back because the Olympic rules allow that now. But to see him against Cruz one day down the line, and I know as we stand, even with the political situation possibly changing in Cuba, that for the moment Cruz is going to have to defect for that fight to happen. But just in that fantasy world of what fights would you love to see? I mean, Keyshawn Davis against Andy Cruz for a light welterweight battle, 3-4 years down the line when they're both really seasoned pros. That would be one to see. But that was the highlight for me of my boxing experience at the Games. And just to talk about the venue there, it was a sumo wrestling venue. And one of the local volunteers there told me that, he said, like you guys in the West, you have Madison Square Garden. This is our Madison Square Garden. And I just thought, Naoya Inoue, the great Japanese bantamweight now, has boxed there early on in his career. And I just thought, if there'd been a crowd in there, again, as I thought many times in the stadium, what a special atmosphere that would have been in what's revered as one of the great Japanese sports venues, wasn't to be. But again, in the absence of crowds, they produced some fantastic sport.